Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from FSD Kenya. It's an honor for me to participate in this webinar to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on low-cost private primary schools in Kenya. First of all, I thank each of you for accepting the invitation and attending this virtual meeting, especially with the prevailing COVID-19 situation. Let me also take this opportunity to thank the meeting organizers who've worked around the clock and challenging conditions to ensure this day happens. On behalf of FSD Kenya, I welcome you to this webinar. Between September and December 2020, FSD Kenya, in partnership with Jim Morridge Insights, carried out a research to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the low-cost private primary schools in Kenya and their recovery prospects. Today, we present the findings of this research. Friends, the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly and negatively affected economies globally. In Kenya, like much of the world, low-income households are particularly been adversely affected. What do the diminishing incomes mean for such households now and in the future? Will these households be able to afford education for their children? The private school education sector has been one of the fastest growing in Kenya. The introduction of the universal primary education in Kenya in 2003 led to emergence of many low-cost private schools. The reason for this growth is twofold: the lack of capacity in the local public schools due to the increased demand and a deterioration in the quality of education in public schools as the pupil-to-teacher ratios significantly increased. It is estimated that there are between 30,000 and 50,000 low-cost private schools in Kenya, and that's both the primary schools and the secondary schools, and those serve between 6 million and 10 million students. Most of these schools are primary schools, though, and they are located in low-income urban and semi-urban areas, with the majority of them being in Nairobi County. The number of public schools in most of these locations has remained the same despite the doubling of the number of students in primary schools following the introduction of the universal primary education. Thus the low-cost private schools fill an important gap in the education sector, and therefore keeping these schools open is not an option. The big question is, how will these schools remain open during COVID-19, and how will they be financed? Our conversations today will create awareness of the state of these low-cost private schools and help strengthen the decision-making process by the various stakeholders to support them. At this juncture, I want to welcome Carol Matiko from Jim Morridge Insights to present the summary of the impact of COVID-19 on the low-cost primary schools research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wanza, for that introduction. So we'll just jump in. So as Wanza said, the purpose of this study was to understand the impact of COVID-19 on low-cost private primary schools in Kenya. And to do that, we had to answer three core questions. First and foremost, to what extent has COVID impacted those schools in terms of how do they see the ability to open? Secondly, will the low cost, will these low-income households be able to afford to take their children back to school? And then thirdly, and this is way beyond even this particular study, is what financing options are they going to be able to come up with that will be able to assist these households pay for education or keep their kids in school. And as Wanza has noted, a rapid literature review highlighted 4 key areas that actually drive the growth of this school. First and foremost, there's limited space in public schools. And of course, that is partly because there are so many kids in the system. And if you think about what she said in 2003 alone, in one day, we had over 1 million children who got into the system who otherwise would not have been able to afford school. And then there is also lack of public schools in certain areas, especially in informal settlements, partly driven by the fact that there is no space. And then there's that whole issue about perceived and real quality concerns, where these low-cost schools, class sizes are much smaller than what you'd find in the public sector. And then finally, we have a legal framework that allows entrepreneurs to enter into that space with fairly limited barriers to entry. Overall, we do not have any universal definition of what is a low-cost private school, but the operational definition we adopted specifically for this study is that we defined this as a school that is, of course, not public, that asks parents to pay an annual fee of 30,000 shillings per annum, with the reference class being grade 4. Of course, there are those who will question, really, can you compare a school, for example, in Turkana, which charges 30,000 a year, with one in Nairobi? That's a discussion altogether. But one thing in future is probably to adjust even that figure based on the basic food basket per county. In terms of approach, the study had 5 main components, and as indicated, the study ran between October and December, and we had a literature review which generated a very comprehensive standalone report. Then there were owners or head teachers' telephonic interviews, which were about 25 minutes each. And this was based from a listing exercise, on-ground listing, using local administrator to give us contacts and referrals and snowballing. And it generated over 2,000 contacts, from which over 900 of them were successful. And many of those interviews were actually with the actual owners or the heads. And that was also followed up with in-depth interviews. And as you can see the spread there, it was across 23 counties. And as Wanza has said also, that a lot of the schools that we are talking about are found around Nairobi and neighboring counties. So if you look at Nairobi, Kajiado, Kiambu, Machakos, they account for a large proportion when combined. Then we had teachers' interviews, and these are from 3 counties, selected counties. And selection really was more to generate some form of a spread, from which we had 302 telephonic interviews with the actual teachers. We also had slightly over 300 interviews with parents, again drawn from the 3 counties, Nairobi, Kisii, and Busia. And for this, the lists were generated by head teachers, and then we had a snowball. And then we had very short conversations with FSPs that tend to operate in that space of MSMEs and have actually developed some products or have been able to give some credit to the actual schools. So just to give you a snapshot of who are these households. So based on their own self-reported income, and remember there is always a question about how accurate is self-reported income, we find that 3/4 of these households were actually living on 10,000 shillings or less per month, and that was the status as of November 2020. And despite that income, they tended to have 3 children in school, yet all of them were dependent on one income earner. So I think consistently, irrespective, we can see that these schools actually serve people who are at the bottom end in terms of income. The low-cost schools vary greatly in terms of student population. We have large schools, we have small schools. In this case, we have about 10% of the schools that had 400 or more students. We have about half that are operating in rented premises. We have some owned by individuals, others owned by a group of individuals. Overall, about half of them were owned by individuals, where the other half was owned either by a CBO, a church group, or some partners. Overall, we have that about half of these schools, 45% of them, had not yet registered with the Ministry of Education. And there are many reasons why they don't, but one thing that came across, some of them really do not know the process. They think it's tedious and expensive, and it will require them to visit several administrative offices. Now, one consistent thing across, despite the fact that these schools have varying number of teachers, some have 8, some have 21, is that all of them have a fairly low average pupil-teacher ratio if you compare with what is recorded in our public primary schools. So they had an overall average pupil-teacher ratio of 20 students, which is impressive when you compare to what is there in the public primary schools. Now, overall, these schools, and the reference point here is what happened in 2019, they financed their operations mainly from school fees. So 95% of the 946 schools indicated that they mainly finance all their school operations from school fees. Less than 10% take a loan for that. And when they do, they're more likely to go to a very formal institution like a bank with a ticket size of about 300,000. When these loans are taken, they tend to go in supporting infrastructure projects. Yeah. So what happens that even when they have rented premises, they sometimes want to repair the roof or improve the floor. They have to cater for those costs. Just to comment about the others indicated there as 12%, this normally relates to income brought in by the school owner, because in many of these smaller towns, you find the owners also have other income generating activities. They might have a grocery shop, an M-Pesa, a restaurant. So they channel some of that money back to the school. But overall, fees is critical in running their operations. So what has been the impact of COVID? And remember, this study was carried out in September to October mainly. And at that time, there is a lot of uncertainty of what would happen when they open. So we find that in 55% of this school, there was some learning activities when schools were closed. And a lot of those learning activities was purely WhatsApp. So what they would do, they would select the candidate class and send them questions on WhatsApp. So despite the fact that there was some learning, we find that 3/4 of the teachers did not receive any pay whatsoever. So from the month of April to September, the teachers report no income. And despite all that, we find that the owners were quite optimistic then that these teachers will resume when called upon. So that issue of, what will happen to teachers who have not been paid, not turning up was never really a concern for most of them. And if we actually look from the perspective of the actual teachers, we find that 8 in every 10 of them have actually accumulated debt. And it makes sense because many of them did not receive any pay. Some of them ended up taking on other jobs. They went into construction. There's a lot of them who were trying to do some form of tuition. Some of them got involved in the Kazi kwa Vijana initiative, but really whatever they were getting there is not comparable in terms of what they get as teachers. And therefore, as a result, their income has dropped, which therefore explains why they reported, a higher proportion reported that actually their debts have increased compared to where they were as in March 2020. We also see that COVID has had an impact on the households, and one of the most obvious impacts is the changes in terms of livelihood options. So we see that there's been an increase in the ones who are dependent on casual work as their main source of livelihood from 39 to 49. But I think the most obvious change has been the shift from employment, which was 32% as in March, and this had dropped to 5% as in October. And sometimes it's not really that they are actually sacked from the actual job, it's a change in the employment contract. So whereas someone was employed on a full-time basis and received a monthly salary, that becomes now based on either piecemeal or a daily rate. We have very little change in terms of owning business, and we find that the sectors that were really hit was domestic work, which we all appreciate that a lot of these households record as their main source of livelihood. So many of them who were employed as domestic workers on a full-time salary were asked to come on alternating days, for example. But we also saw some shifts in terms of the actual business categories, where business owners were shifting away from non-essentials like clothes and electronic and shifting back to now sale of food items, which are seen as more popular. Households have also suffered because, a lot of them are using up their savings. So you find that despite using up all their savings, 8 in every 10 of them has still indicating that they have more debt than they had in 2020. So their savings are not necessarily able to cover all their needs. And we can see other unique things they are doing. We are seeing a lot of selling of assets, 13%. And one asset that is very common and easy to sell, at least from our observation from some of the informal settlements in Nairobi, was gas cylinders. So when we visited some of the outlets that buy second-hand items, they indicated they had an increase in gas cylinders that were available for sale. And another thing that households indicated is that they are actually struggling to providing meals. And remember, these households that typically would provide 2 or 1 meal a day. So typically the children would leave in the morning, maybe have some basic breakfast, but ideally they would have lunch, no matter how basic, provided by the school. So that has been a big struggle for them. There's the issue of course rent. Rent has been a big problem. And if you walk into the slums, you'll see some households that actually the landlords have pulled off the roofing just to make life very difficult for the tenants so they can move out. And one of the things is that chamas have too many requests coming in. Everybody needs some money, yet they are not able to collect the usual contributions. And households have also experienced some unique challenges, which probably might be recorded more so in the lower income households than in other places. So one of the things is the collapse of certain livelihood options. So one unique sector is daycare and pig rearing. Just to give you an example, so one of the daycare businesses is a lady who normally serves moms who tend to work in the airport, in the packing business, in the flower horticulture packing business. And these moms leave very early, so they drop off the kids in this daycare. And this lady prepares the kids for school, drops all the kids to school, picks them for lunch. Sometimes she even goes for school meetings on behalf of the parents because these mothers are not able to get time off. So that business collapsed overnight because, if there is no travel, there's no work, you're at home, you can stay with your kids. And then pig rearing. In some of these smaller informal settlements, you'll find there's a bit of pig rearing in small towns like Busia. And what we found is that is actually mainly based on access to hotel waste. So when hotels ceased operating, suddenly they could not be able to take care of their pigs and they had to sell off their pigs pretty quick. Then again, as just to reiterate, that rent was a big challenge. And one of the challenges in terms of how they cope is that they move to smaller houses. But that becomes an issue in terms of privacy. And we find that it's very traumatizing. And we had households where, parents were seeking that their daughters get jobs as living maids, just so as they can get some semblance of privacy by getting to stay somewhere else. And then we find that the wage rates, despite a very difficult time, the wage rates have reduced. And this, of course, is that you have so many people looking for the same job, but we also have people who take advantage of these situations. And then very unique, something that we found very interesting is that ownership of assets, especially in the village, requires you to constantly check on them. And if you can't travel because of cessation of travel, then there's a high risk that you will lose that asset. And we had stories of people who have not been home for 3 months and, they no longer can, access their piece of land, their goats or their chicken have been sold. And then, of course, we have the whole issue of domestic violence, which has been repeatedly covered by in the media. Of course, it's all the tension that comes with issues around money. So those are just some of the unique challenges. There are very many, and of course, no report can do justice by saying that they are able to capture all of them. So how has it been in terms of the journey to recovery? So remember, this report was done before schools reopened completely. So one of the things that was very clear is that reopening really presents a big challenge in terms of the financial demands, in terms of meeting the safety needs and as well as financing all the operational issues. So they have to observe the protocols, which, for example, talk about social distancing. But how do you manage that when you have to think about the books, the desks, the play area? How do children travel home and come back? But how do you also maintain physical contact with young learners who are coming from very difficult backgrounds, and sometimes you need that hug? Schools also lack that working capital, to buy the basics, the PPE, to provide enough water, to provide storage for that water, to provide soap. And also it's a dilemma. Right now, they owe huge arrears, but at the same time, they're being asked to build more classes. Many a times, they would have to collaborate with the landlord, for example, to do that. So it sounds really unfair to ask the landlord to support such initiatives when you owe him so much money. And then there's the whole issue about providing safety nets, for example, like feeding programs, which are very critical. And this is more the case given that we all heard in January that there's an announcement that the government is going to roll out a feeding program that is going to target grade 1 to 3 in slums and arid areas. And these schools now, more than anything, want to remain competitive. So they also want to be able to provide those feeding programs. And also they are very conscious that parents are unlikely to accommodate any extra financing demand. So whereas in the past they were able to say this is fees and this is development fee or charges, that's going to be very difficult given that parents are really struggling. And then as schools, all the tension in the home environment, be it parents who are stressed out because of lack of money, being the fact that we have more households where one parent has opted to move to the village if they don't have a job, be it the whole issue that some of them have pushed their kids to work and kids have been exposed to a totally different environment, that they as a school are expected to address those issues, yet they do not have that expertise in-house to do that kind of counseling. So that is something else they also noted as a potential challenge for them. And these challenges are not restricted to either men or women. Both of them are going to suffer, meaning the owners of these schools, irrespective of gender, are going to have problems. So one of the issues, at least for women, which is a positive, is that because many of them come from double income houses, because they are married, they have a spouse, they are able to get some direct support in cash, or they're excluded from domestic bills, so they're able to focus on their business. And also clearly from the conversations, we found that female owners tended to receive a lot more remittances from their relatives, be it their uncle, their brothers, their other female relatives, and that is consistent with what has been recorded in the financial diaries. And also one thing we noted about the female owners, they tended to come across qualitatively as having higher degrees of perseverance. And this is more likely because what really drives them to start these schools might not always be the revenues and the profits, but they are driven by other factors such as, creating safe environments for the children in the community, supporting their communities. So they might be willing to go that extra mile, provided they're breaking even, they might go for a couple of years. On the other hand, men might find it easier to continue operating these schools because many a times you find that men always have multiple businesses. And this is consistent with other studies we've done, for example. And you find that in some of these schools, actually, the person managing the school on a day-to-day is the spouse, where the man is running other businesses. Outside Nairobi, the men are the ones who own the collateral. That school is on their own family land or his own land that he bought. So he's able to get collateral to be able to buy that, to get more finances if need be. And then one thing we found is that men are less likely to retain expenses based on an emotional appeal. So if there's no money coming in, I'll cut off the related expenses. Whereas when we were talking to the female owners qualitatively, we found some of them were getting money from their savings, from their other businesses, to try and provide teachers with a small token so that they can survive those months. But men were very clear, no money is coming in, I'll see you when schools open again. So that might give them a sense of resilience. So what really is a concern for the schools? It's all about finances, and the finances comes from the whole question of, will parents be able to pay? And that is consistent given that school fees is what really funds their operations. So for them is, how will I be able to collect the money needed? And then how will I be able to channel that cash to sort out the rent and all the other infrastructure requirement? You find in terms of a financial burden, only 8% feel that the funds to manage the COVID protocol will be a major issue. And even if we look on the other side at some of the non-financial issues, which only 12% mentioned that they are going to be an issue, we find that when they describe them, there are still issues that will require finances. When 46% say one of the non-financial issues I have is how do I manage the COVID protocol? When they continue to describe it, they describe scenarios where, with the money, I definitely can make it. And I think one thing you have to appreciate is that they come from areas where people see, they might not be as worried about Corona as they are worried about trying to sort out the school fees payments. And you can see there's a beautiful quote there. People in this area don't fear Corona. Maybe in town, but in reserves, they don't wear masks. Maybe only when one is going to town. So it's like, this thing happens in town. Maybe here we are protected. And in town here, they mean big towns like Nairobi. Yeah, and some of these owners recognize that really we need to make certain adjustments. And one of the adjustments they're really looking into is how can they manage school payments. It has nothing to do with reducing fees, but maybe is to accept lower value staggered payments. And some of them are even talking about differentiating pricing, where they are able to say that these parents might get a 10% discount. Of course, this is not announced in public, but they're figuring it. The main interest for them is to retain all parents. There are those who are thinking, of course, getting credit or trying to source support from their sponsors or their donors. But ideally for them, it's if schools function, that can only be a factor of parents' ability to pay school fees. And then at that time, when we did the study in October, only 2% of the schools indicated that they would not open. They said we are unlikely to reopen. Okay, and even for those that we reopen, there was a concern that they're going to get lesser students. And these lesser students, the reality is in many of these informal settlements, when people do not have a job, they move back to the village. Or then there's also the concern that, there's some parents who will not be able to pay. But I think the biggest concern is that there has been a change in the households there where people have moved. But on the other hand, we have 20% schools that say they will gain more, mainly because they'll have schools that have closed in the area, but we also have the movement of people, probably from lower middle income households, maybe who are moving in some of these informal settlements. Now, one unique thing about these 2% schools that indicated that they will not reopen, when we followed some of them up and discussed, we found that they had already major challenges even before COVID. They had huge challenges with school fees payments, so they were not collecting, they had a lot of bad debts, and they also had a higher teacher attrition than the other schools that we were able to talk to qualitatively. So schools that already had challenges, that Corona pushed them over the edge. Yeah? So one thing just to comment about rent, and we managed to talk to one or two landlords, is that it is true that schools do owe us some money, but the reality is if you kick them out, what will you do with the building? Because reconverting them to residential requires funds. So a lot of them, will hold on. Some of them have given discounts. Some of them have asked them to start paying as soon as they start getting in income. So that's a big priority for some of the school who owe rent, is that they need to collect money to be able to clear their rent arrears. So one of the things that makes this sector a bit resilient is that the teachers, which are a big component of these schools running, will always be there. Getting teachers back, as indicated previously, is not a challenge. And by the time we were going into field, because we went to the field to talk to the teachers when class 8 and grade 4 had resumed, 9 out of 10 teachers had resumed or were likely to resume based on the interviews. So that is not seen as a problem. And actually one of the issues here is a lot of these teachers felt that without this school, it's very difficult for me to get a school elsewhere. So 6 out of 10 of the teachers indicated, you know what, I need to go back because the reality is getting another school elsewhere is going to be very difficult. And these teachers are still committed to the profession, with almost 9 out of 10 of them saying, you know what, I'm here for the long haul. I am likely to continue pursuing my career as a teacher. Another factor that contributes to resilience is that education is irreplaceable. So parents will take their kids back to those schools. 85% of the parents indicated that, the kids will go back. And for them, their biggest concern is mainly about paying school fees. Yes, they are concerned about health issues, but that is secondary compared to paying school fees. And we have to appreciate that in some of these informal settlements, schools are actually considered as a safe haven. We had situations where some parents were asking schools to please open and get our girls to stay in the school so that they can do some learning and get away from this home environment. Only 15% of the parents say they are unlikely, and that uncertainty is not driven because of necessarily that they don't have money. They just need to know whether or not their school of choice is going to reopen. So we asked the teachers, what is that you need to open? And 57% of SENS say they do require some financial assistance. And overall, 47% of all schools say that assistance really needs to come from the states. So if you look more keenly, that the schools that are saying we need assistance, 64% are saying the government should be the one. And why they chose the government is they are indicating that, this is a widespread problem. The person who has the ability and the skill to handle it is the government. And we appreciate that really we have a quarter of the schools that are saying in 3 months we are back. And these are popular schools in these areas where parents are very keen to get their kids back, and schools have performed pretty well over the years. So that's quite clear. A school that was already doing academically very well and has a good relationship with the parents is likely to survive and run optimally in a very short time. And then we asked the parents, how long will it take you to get back to the status you were in as at March 2020? And you have a situation where 4 in every 10 are saying it will take me 6 or more months. And the support they're looking for is not necessarily handouts. Some of them are saying, give us the money to restart our businesses. which had since collapsed, or to start new businesses, and we'll be able to sustain our children and be able to pay the fees. Yeah. So one thing you have to realize is parents' biggest concern is actually getting the finances to repay school fees, not necessarily about the safety in relation to COVID. And a lot of these parents are very keen that their children catch up because they realize that, other kids in middle income households have been having online classes, and they have very short time. They know that the school calendar is very stressed and very compacted, and they need to catch up. So they are keen to go that extra mile to pay. I mean, we try to explore a bit about distance learning, and they appreciate, yes, that you can provide gadgets, but there's a cost of connectivity, and also there's the issue of technology illiteracy that these parents might not be able to support their kids. And we all appreciate that these online classes demanded a lot from the parents, and these parents are conscious that they might not be able to offer that. And 55% of the parents are willing to borrow to pay school fees under those circumstances that were there as at October, November. And that proportion is willing to commit at least 1,500 every month to repay that loan amount should they receive it. So basically they are saying in every one term, I'm able to repay back 4,500. And remember, they're not asking you to give them the full amount. They're asking for a top up. Should that product come in, they're not saying I'll take the entire fees, but I'm just taking an amount, because they also have other children. And one thing we realize that whatever product is developed, especially to support them, is that they tend to make very small irregular payments. And some of the headmasters talk about, receiving as little as 500 today, tomorrow you receive 800. There's no really fixed payment schedule. And of course, it's challenging to keep tallying those 500s and 800s. Yeah. And interestingly, parents have also noted that there was an increase already in fees, especially those who had their kids in grade 4 and grade 8 who had already resumed. They said there was some increment, but they were not so sure whether that is being driven by arrears that they had, because some of them had not paid for term 1, or whether that's something new. And although we appreciate that in these schools are accepting small irregular payment, we find that pre-COVID, many of these households were very faithful to their charmers. They were paying regularly and a fixed amount. So they have that habit in them to make regular payments. And then, of course, there's also the idea of exploring what saving solutions would help these parents actually regularly put aside. Because remember, only slightly over half are willing to take credit. So the others are only willing to fund from their own income or from current savings. So in conclusion, really, financial service providers may be willing to finance the low-cost schools based on the few that we spoke to, but it's an extremely high-risk category. And schools rely on loans to service. Schools will rely on fees to service loans. So we have to remember, whatever credit you give them, there has to be a way to ensure that the parents are able to pay so they can collect the money and pay. Yet currently, parents are really struggling to pay fees. Households are also willing to borrow for fees, but incomes have really reduced. So will we have a situation where we have a higher than usual default rate? And then there's also that whole thing of what saving solutions can really help parents set aside some little money over time so that they can be able to meet their children's educational needs. So basically, this presentation ends with a question in terms of what are those financing options that can really enable low-income households at household level be able to pay for school education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. I think I've certainly learned a lot just by listening to you, even though I was part of the team that was involved in this. So thank you very much, Carol, and thank you, Wanza, for the introduction. So my name is Anzat Saware, and I am the senior economist at FSD Kenya. And now what we're going to do is that we're going to have a panel with 3 distinguished guests that will provide their insights and their feedback on the report, as well as start to grapple with the last question that Carol presented. So as I call your name, please just switch on your video so that we can get on with the panelists. So our first panelist is Deborah Kimathi. Deborah Kimathi is the Executive Director at Dignitas, and Dignitas was actually birthed in Mathare. Is an organization that has been identified as a school leader, and it views schools as a source of strength for the communities in which they operate. Just to bear in mind that Dignitas has grown from working with just 20 partner schools in 2017 to partnering with 340 schools this year. Dignitas now partners with the government to support public schools and influence education policy and practice. Dignitas is an award-winning training and coaching program that is designed to strengthen school team capacity to deliver education that transforms student potential. So welcome, Deborah. Our second panelist is Amos Mwangi. He's the Chief Executive Officer at Ed Partners Africa. Ed Partners Africa is an early-stage social enterprise that offers loans and advisory services to affordable private schools in Kenya in order to improve access to quality education. Amos, before joining Ed Partners, worked with Faulu, which is a microfinance institution, and he holds a master's degrees in banking and microfinance, as well as being an alumni of institutions like INSEAD and the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. So he really has a good understanding of education finance. And then finally, our third panelist is Dr. Wanza Bole, our own FSD Senior Economic Inclusion Advisor. She's part of the Financial Innovation for the Real Economy team that actually commissioned this research, whose work entails innovating finance solutions for households and smaller businesses. And of special interest to her is school education finance. And she's an economic inclusion enthusiast who sees access to education as a means to attaining economic inclusion. So welcome, panelists. So I'm going to start with you, Deborah. First of all, if you could just give us an idea, what do you think of the key findings of the research? You know, what jumped out to you the most? And from where you're sitting, giving all the experience that you have, what are your greatest concerns regarding the reopening of these schools, given what Carol has walked us through?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's great to be here with you. And thank you, Carol, for taking us through the presentation. There really is a wealth of information in there. I think it adds to a slowly building body of evidence that speaks to some of the needs present in these low-cost private schools. I mean, I think that the findings of the report really resonate with us. We worked very closely with our school partners across Nairobi's informal settlements in particular during the COVID school closures last year. And we saw many of the same issues that come out of this research. And through our own focus group discussions, many of the same concerns were expressed. I think a couple of things I'd like to highlight. Clearly from the research, very few schools offered continuity of learning. As Dignitas, that's one of our key concerns because we believe that every school should be a place for children to thrive and succeed. So it's really of key concern to us to understand how schools can drive learning during future shocks, but also what that learning gap might be now. We saw across the country very poor rollout of online learning and other ways to keep the majority of children engaged. But with even these 45% of schools who said they did something, usually they were targeting the candidate class, maybe just a small number of learners. And in fact, then you find that from PP1 all the way through to class 7, it may have been entirely left out. So there's a huge gap in learning, and that needs to be addressed urgently. I think the other thing that we see both just in general across these types of schools and particularly during the COVID season, as it were, is that these schools often provide much more than just education. So whether it's that the school is that safe space in the community where parents know their girls are safe, whether it's the school that is the biggest input for nutrition and feeding, we hear many children say that the only decent meal they eat in a day is the meal they eat in school. So there are all these other social, emotional, physical buffers and provisions that these schools make. During the COVID season, we saw some schools try to continue this, but it really did leave a huge gap. And what does that mean for children's well-being? And even now as they get back to school, what does that mean for their socio-emotional well-being. One of the things we learned through COVID was that you can only talk about learning once well-being is taken care of. So how do we get past that first hurdle so that actually we can begin to talk about learning? And I think the study also notes that there are concerns in how these schools are brought together, how they're registered. It noted the low percentage registered with Ministry of Education. Often they're registered in other ways, but what does that mean for how we monitor quality? And even those that are registered with Ministry of Education, I think if you ask them, they would tell you that they very rarely get visits from the Ministry of Education that actually support quality. So what does that mean for these schools? And Carol even used the phrase about perceived quality, and what is the perceived versus realistic quality of education offered in these schools. So quality, again, for us as Dignitas, is just a huge concern. In terms of what next and what the concerns are, I think, building on what I've said, that idea of quality, this focus on learning and well-being, much of the conversation right now, whether from government or from financial institutions willing to support the school, those conversations are based on around infrastructure, around wash stations and extra desks and extra classrooms. Very few of those conversations are about learning and well-being. So how do we make sure that, yes, let's equip them to safely host learners in the midst of the ongoing pandemic, but how do we also make sure that they're actually learning while they're there, that the whole purpose which brings them to school is actually fulfilled? Because if not, I think we'll have some serious questions to answer in the future. I think also just the nature of how these schools run, their dependency on fees collection from parents, and the report highlights this very well, is what happens when parents can't pay fees. We actually did some of our own research a couple of years back and found that typically these schools collect around 60% of their fees. So now with this added layer of economic difficulty and all the various challenges, if that drops further, can these schools survive? Already, most schools would pay their teachers just 9 months out of 12, not pay them for the holiday months. What will happen now if those schools can't pay their teachers for the whole 9 or 12 months? And then I think the final thing I would highlight, and it was interesting that this didn't come out in the report, is the nature of teachers who work in these schools. So what we find is only about 70% of the teachers in these schools are actually qualified, and an even lower percentage are qualified at the right level for what they're teaching. So what does that mean for quality? What does that mean for how the schools manage this current situation, but also how they manage future shocks? And as we think about the school as a whole ecosystem of infrastructure, teachers, learners, parents, what investments need to be made beyond infrastructure to make sure that that quality is there and the school is sustained through this and future shocks. So back to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deborah, for that insight. And once I just want to pull you in now in terms of trying to unpack what your key takeaways were. Obviously, you're part of the group that the team that commissioned this, but given your focus on economic inclusion, really working with very low income communities, what did you see as the key takeaways?
Thanks, Ansetse. For me, to ride on to something that Deborah said a moment ago, the biggest one for me was the loss of learning, or the lack of learning during the time when schools were closed. I was surprised by the percentage of the schools that did not deliver any form of teaching or support learning by the children during that period. And from a forum that a different forum that I attended yesterday, it said that even for schools that they offered teaching to children or to the students, there was still a loss of learning. But I can only imagine what that loss was for the category of schools that we're talking about, where for 9 months there was no contact with them. And we're talking about households that are low income and typically, given the intersectionality between income generation and skills, one would almost assume that those households, or the parents, the guardians, and the other members of the households had less capacity to support the learners among them than higher income households. And to me, that's worrisome. And it goes to accentuate the inequality, the economic inequality between households in the country. It's hard to imagine what this means and what we're likely to see going forward, as whether we're talking about a COVID-19 new normal, or even if we were to get out of the current situation, the pandemic, and start to get back to the life that was, what would that mean in terms of inequality? It bothers me. And so that was my biggest takeaway. The other one relates to the need, or what it would take for the schools to reopen. And looking at the numbers related to household incomes, and knowing what we know about the low-cost private schools and the role they play in delivering education to that segment, which has little choice but to use what's around them. They can't take kids far away from their locations. What's the hope for those schools? What's the hope for the households? How can those schools be financed? Because closing them for sure isn't an option. And it gets me extremely bothered. I don't know what solutions there are out there. And we can speak to that later, but I think there is a problem there. So the other highlight I got out of these was the importance that the households attach to education. I've always known that to many who are in dire need, accessing education is seen as the hope for tomorrow, the route out of poverty, the way to give children or those households a better future. And so it wasn't surprising that I think this is a quote that was in one of the earlier versions of the slides, or in a different slide out of the ones that we didn't use for these, but something to the effect that parents are willing to send children to school in turns. Like, have a child attend school one term. If you have more than one in school, and the next one or the other one goes to school the term after that, because they can't afford to keep those kids in school. And I see education as a basic service for any household. And I start to think of the level of desperation that those households are in. And it clearly calls for support. It's no surprise that most of them feel that the government needs to support, because it's that basic a need. It's as basic as accessing food. And we've heard of many that were going to bear, or probably still are going to bear, without food. But it needs to be given that sense of priority, because it's what it is. Access to education, needs to be given that kind of priority. Thanks.
Thank you, Anza. That's very sobering. And I think that then makes us start thinking about, well, okay, so then what's feasible? So Amos, let me bring you in here. Obviously, we've seen that the financial challenges are key. So can you just give us some perspective, given where you sit at Ed Partners, what were the key financial challenges for the low-cost schools before COVID? And then how have you seen that change as COVID has really come in to hit them?
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for organizing this. I want to say that this survey has confirmed what we have always believed as Ed Partners. Actually, Ed Partners was formed to come and address the gap that we saw in the market. Low-cost, affordable schools have been having challenges as far as access to finance is concerned. If you look at the survey, it is saying that most of the financing is done from the savings or the surplus that is left from the school fees. Access to loans, loan facilities from formal financial institutions has not been coming through for microfinance, for affordable private schools. And this is largely because the feeling is that the affordable private schools present a high credit risk. They do not keep books of accounts. When you go down there, you realize that they use registers. You're not able to determine their cash flows and all that. So what Ed Partners did is to come up with a way of assessing that credit risk and determining whether the school is able to pay or not without using sophisticated tools like financial statements and all that. So I would say finance management also is not very good within the affordable private schools. There's need to improve that so that then we can be able to open up credit. The other challenge that I see is that local schools do not get trade credit. You know, they are always using fuel to transport the kids from school to home. They access these services on cash basis. So meaning that running a school, you need to have cash that is readily available to be able to do that. Now, COVID-19 actually aggravated a situation which was already bad in terms of, if you look at the fee collection rates, they have been affected by the issue that you've just been told about the parents losing their incomes. So they're not able to pay the fees in lump sum, they're paying in bits and pieces. Some kids have not been able to come back to school. So again, finance management becomes a problem for affordable private schools. In terms of access to finance, the former financial institutions that were having challenges giving credit to affordable private schools will not even look at them. They have better choices to look at SMEs and corporates. So again, that accelerates the challenges that you're talking about today. So as Ed Partners, what we have done is that we have used our insights and the knowledge that we have about affordable private schools to come up with solutions that will address them. For instance, when COVID-19 came in last year, we knew that they would have challenges as far as payment of their own facilities is concerned. So we give them a moratorium on both principal and interest all the way from April to end of December. The other thing that we did is that we knew meeting the reopening requirements would be a challenge. So we came up with a working capital product from around October, thereabout, to meet the health and safety requirements, the COVID-19 protocols, and also to address some of the working capital challenges that they had. It will surprise you that to meet the Ministry of Health requirements as far as school reopening is concerned, our survey was showing that you needed at least 300,000 shillings to be able to meet all those requirements. So you need a financier who has deep insights, deep understanding of the education sector to be able to come up with solutions that are relevant to the affordable private schools.
Thank you. That's really great, very specific and insightful information around that. And Deborah, I want to bring you back in here. Amos is talking about the mobilization of finances. And I really want you to bring in your insights around the challenges you've seen, and particularly look at, are there any regional differences? I mean, obviously people tend to always have Nairobi in mind when we talk about these schools, but we saw that these schools exist all over the country. So what are the challenges that you've seen around those regional differences?
That's a really interesting question. So NAPANEC is the arm of Ministry of Education tasked with overseeing these particular group of schools. And just a few months back, they published a report that had data kind of from a mapping exercise they conducted with these schools actually across the country. And what was interesting is that whilst many of the challenges are similar across the different regions, they're intensified in Nairobi, partly because just the number of schools is so much higher. In Nairobi alone, I think it was about 1,700 schools that they mapped. And I remember in the report launch, it was very interesting. A gentleman from Ministry of Education, who I won't name, stood up and made the assumption that there's probably about 20,000 children in these schools in Nairobi, whereas the report itself that was being launched in the same meeting actually had counted about 320,000 children across those 1,600 schools. And the report notes that they simply didn't have the time and resource to keep counting all the schools. Everywhere they went, they found another corner in another school, and anybody who's been in the informal settlements and seen the setup understands how every corner you go around, you find another 2 or 3 schools, and so it's a challenge that we don't yet fully understand the magnitude of. And it exists, as you say, across the country. NACONEC itself as a body, many people assume it just operates in Nairobi because that's where these schools are, whereas no, they actually operate across 14 counties. So it's a huge challenge, and it's a systemic challenge, and to be honest, I think needs a systemic solution, at least alongside some of these other processes. So the challenges persist, and across the board, it's in response to either perceived poor quality of public education or real poor quality of public education, but as well as just the distance to schools, the public schools, the distance to public schools and how accessible those are. In some communities, is there a highway between where we live and where the school is, and is it safe for me to send my child? And in others, for example, in the pastoralist communities, it's that the public school does not meet the needs of me as a pastoralist. It doesn't work with either my schedule or how I move around and that kind of thing. So there are huge needs driven by slightly different factors across the regions, but a lot of the issues are the same.
Thanks, Deborah. That's really interesting, the insights you're saying around the different communities that exist. So now I guess, Wanza, my question to you is, given the complexity of the situation that was already there before COVID, and we're just seeing, that really being worsened, what are the different roles, particularly for government and private sector, in the recovery of these low-cost schools? Because, obviously the sense has been they just sort themselves out and they just sort of figure things out on their own. But we have a situation where it needs to be a bit more collaboration. So really, what are your ideas around particularly government and private sector here?
Thanks for that question. It's an important one particularly for the government to consider. And given what we've heard from Carol on the research insights, it's clear that households do not have the capacity to pay for the education of their children, despite the willingness to pay. I find it puzzling to think of a household that can't even afford to put food on the table, wanting to borrow to pay school fees. And the numbers you were shown are quite telling. Like if the fees translates to about 10,000 shillings per term per child, and the household is only able to pay 1,500 shillings per month. And it's willing, despite the high levels of indebtedness, the 80-something%, to borrow towards school fees. What does that mean in terms of capacity? They simply can't afford to pay. And short of those children getting out of school or being transferred to some public schools, assuming that they are public schools in the places where they live, or public schools with some capacity to absorb them, that someone has to do something outside the household. I think that responsibility rests with the government. There are certain things the private sector could do, and we've heard of opportunities around enabling the schools the households to remit the small savings that they can make towards school fees to the schools. Of course, not overlooking the financial management challenge that Amos alluded to. But those savings will never be enough. So I feel like it will take the government doing something to support the continued attendance of school. And I'm using attendance because I'm quite aware of the quality issue that Deborah has mentioned many times. That continued being in school for all sorts of reasons, but core among those being with the hope that they will learn during the COVID pandemic, and even as we start to get into the recovery. And once household incomes improve, then the parents who are already more than willing to pay for their children's education and have been paying in the past anyway, assume would naturally take it on again. So that's my immediate take. I know the government has many competing priorities. It's not just about education. It's not, but I think there are some priorities that could wait and others that can. Like education for children might not be one of those you park for the next 10 years. We could wait to have better roads or other longer term non-recurrent investments. We could wait to make those, but education can't wait. The other argument would be that the government is already subsidizing education for households similar to those through the public schools. And we know for a fact that we've not had many public schools coming up since the introduction of the universal primary education. So the private sector, those small businesses are basically helping the government deliver a basic service in the form of education. And the government could do something to support households collectively, not just a few who have their children in the public schools.
Thank you. Thank you for that one, Zah. And I think that really just now gets to the point of, okay, so then what actual financing options exist? So Amos, I really want to bring you in here. Obviously, you've seen the sort of financial options that low-cost schools are presented with when they're trying to keep their schools going. So if you could just give us an idea of what sort of exists in the market around the financing options that these schools have, and in your mind, what would be a more ideal solution? I know you'd alluded to some of that before, but we really want to distinguish between what exists now, but what really needs to exist.
Okay, thank you, Anteta. Yeah, it's a big challenge that the finance sector needs to look at. At the moment, we have what we call loan facilities that are being given to the local schools. Of course, as I said earlier, the supply is not adequate. I think what the survey is telling us is that, yes, most of the schools have been financing their expansion using savings, using surplus, but they're telling us it's not adequate. We believe that it's not adequate because doing additional infrastructure in terms of classrooms, in terms of libraries and other facilities that are needed in school are capital intensive projects. You also need school transport, among other things. Now, the finance sector will still need to innovate further and come up with better solutions that are custom-made for affordable private schools to be able to ensure that we are addressing the demand that is coming from the growing number of children who need education. In terms of the parents, as Wanza has said, the challenge of financing school fees is that sometimes the product may not be appropriate for all that will be needing such kind of a product. So you may need some government intervention or donor interventions to be able to create good school fee solutions. However, the way I see the long-term solution for the education sector being is that we need various players to come together and offer solutions to this sector. For instance, the government can be able to support through voucher schemes or giving bursaries to students. And when you have a voucher, you can go to any affordable private schools that you're interested in. You do not have to go to a public school. So if you have a voucher scheme that the government is running to support those ones who are not able to pay. However, for the financial sector, we need to have risk-sharing agreements and first loss kind of guarantees that can be provided by the government, by the donor community, by DFIs, to be able to unlock more credit to the affordable private school sector. That can create appetite within the sector, and it can unlock more credit towards this sector, and that would ensure that there's competition and that the schools continue to expand. Why I say this is because the population continues to expand at the rate of 3% per annum. More children demand to be educated. The public sector is not expanding as fast. So we need to somehow enable the affordable private schools to cater for the growing demand. And for me, private sector has a role, the government has a role, DFIs have a role. They all need to work together to create solutions that work for this sector.
Anzete, we can't hear you. Can you hear us? Can anyone confirm if you can hear me?
We can hear you, Nancy, but we can't hear Anset.
Let's just breathe in for a few seconds as we try to have Anzete join us. She's reconnecting. Thank you.
Hey, the house was literally smooth. You heard.
Hi, I'm back.
Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. So I think I had just finished up when Amos was explaining the different financial products that need to exist in order for the low-cost schools to recover credibly. And I believe, were you able to finish that question? Amos, were you able to finish?
Yes, I was. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So then I'll just go into the final round of questions, and I'll start again with you, Deborah. So as you answer this question, maybe just also give us some of your closing comments. So just building off of what Amos was saying, in your view, what are the key ideas that you have, specifically that you're interested in implementing around supporting the full restoration and recovery of these low-cost schools?
Thank you so much for that question. So we, as Dignitas, are actually currently running with a number of partner schools, a school reopening and recovery program. And that's an 8-module program that's designed to support school partners in different facets of reopening. So everything from complying with the COVID-19 protocols, and we have some grants to make that possible, to learning recovery, and what strategies teachers can use in their classrooms to help bridge that gap and make sure children catch up with their learning. It also covers educator well-being. So all the stresses and trauma and anxieties that not just the learners, but also the teachers and school leaders have experienced through this season. And how do we get their well-being back on track? Because if we don't think about teacher and school leader well-being, we can't think about learner well-being. They're the ones supposed to nurture the well-being of the learners in the school environment. And of course, then looking at how we build this resilience amongst our learners. How do we support their socio-emotional development in that way? And helping them think through how can they continue to leverage remote learning to bridge those gaps? How can they get their school management back on track? So this 6-month program is intended to really equip them to answer some of those questions. It's all designed for low resource schools in low resource environments, because that's what's at the heart of Dignitas as an organization. But we're just one piece of the puzzle, and we're just one player in a big space. And I think Amos Alwanza brought out really strongly the importance of collaboration at a time like this. So there's the role of government. Government could think about capitation for these schools. TSE could deploy teachers. There could be many different ways government could support. But there is the private sector and civil society. And oftentimes we're not very good at collaborating with each other. So how do we best come together? How do we establish that shared vision about what needs to happen? As Wanzatso rightly put it, that these children access their basic right to education. We're not asking for some luxury or something that's not beyond a basic right. So how do we do that? And I think one of the other important pieces, and this I think would be my final point for this sector, is better representation. Right now we have a bit of a mismatch of different associations that represent different portions of these schools. So even when it comes to lobbying for better policies and better support, it's really tricky to do that with a united voice, with a strong voice that presents a united front and lobbies in a coherent way that the government can then respond to. So how do we, as different collaborators, come together to help nurture the growth of that body that represents these schools, and make sure that the voices of these teachers, these educators, these school leaders, and most of all these learners and these families, that their voices are heard and taken as important.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deborah. So now, Wanza, I want you to answer this and then also give your closing comments. Where do you think FSD Kenya can play in this? And what opportunities does FSD Kenya have in helping these low-cost schools really recover?
Thanks for the question. I think there is consensus to the effect that keeping these schools running will take both support by the government and by the private sector. And FSD Kenya has worked in both those spaces. What immediately comes to mind is the work that we've done on social protection. And we've experience and expertise that we can harness if the government requires that to support to support the relevant departments think through what solutions will be appropriate for the households that we're talking about. And to the private sector, where key strength seems to be. There's been mention of, right from the research insights that Carol shared with us to a point that Em was made not long ago, with opportunities for coming up with appropriate finance solutions that would help the parents make savings towards their children's education. And those are things that we could support the private sector to do. It's what we exist to do as FSD Kenya. And to Amos's point about schools borrowing, in as much as we're talking of the risk associated with that, you mentioned that there is room or an opportunity for de-risking private sector players working in that space to avail the capital that the schools require to get the schools running during the pandemic. And I think the real opportunity relates to having longer term loans with say some kind of money grace period, which would enable them to do what they need to do at the moment as they wait to start to repay those loans. And it will be interesting for FSD to explore that, and to also look into what other partners, be it development partners or others, out there will be able to provide the level of support that's required for that kind of lending and other finance solutions to happen. But in closing, we don't have options. We have to keep those schools open. They are private businesses. They need all the support that they can get for the sake of the households who have their children there. One can't wait till say 3 years later to continue learning.
Thanks, Wanza. And I think we'll just close on that with you, Amos. At the end of the day, particularly for private sector, there's going to have to be a business case for anybody to sort of put their money into, what we know is a very important sector. So in your mind, what are the key business opportunities or the key business cases that you would make and that seem really viable in order to really anchor in the scale of financing that would be required from the private sector?
Okay, thank you, Atete. And I must say that education is such a critical sector that you can't afford to ignore it. Nelson Mandela once said that education is the only tool that you can use to alleviate poverty. And the market has been given a challenge to innovate and come up with solutions that would work for this sector. The first thing that, as we said, is of course creating access to capital. As ed partners, we see our role being creating access to capital to increase access to quality education within this sector. We need to keep innovating more and more, coming up with products that are relevant to this sector, because what I've seen in this sector is that your normal, typical SME solutions do not work for affordable private schools. The other thing that I see is fee correction. And as I said earlier, that management of school fees, record keeping within schools is a big problem. So anyone who can come up with a fee correction solution that helps schools to manage their finances better, that helps schools to reconcile, I know who has paid, who has not paid, that would be useful, and it can also help the schools to create, to de-risk the schools in a way that financiers can be able to appraise them and see whether they are eligible for credit or not. The other thing that COVID-19 has brought, and we need to appreciate that it do not go away, is the need for online learning. Online learning will be required to complement classroom environment. So there are solutions that are needed in terms of affordable tablets, affordable solutions that can work with and without internet, solutions that can work for the low-income people will be required. That also cuts across even the online learning content, because at the moment, I don't think we have content that we can disseminate globally, even to the low-cost schools. School management systems, I've talked about that. We need to improve the systems within schools. You know, historically, we have always received a diary with the homework. I think that needs to be automated, and we need to be able to reduce the use of paper as far as school interaction, parental engagement is concerned. Lastly, but not the least, there's an opportunity to come up with insurance products. I think it's Wanza who was talking about savings, but I think the insurance sector can come up with products that can help secure the future of these children as far as education is concerned, and even simple issues like personal accidents within schools, incidents that are there, and of course, ensuring the school assets. It's an area that is new. We are passionate about it, and we believe that affordable, low-cost private schools are starting to receive attention. They are now demanding the center stage, and we can't afford to ignore them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Wanza. Thank you, Amos, for a very productive and very engaging session. And so with that, we do come to the close of the webinar.